Hi there. My next video for your yoga class will be a middle sequence that focuses on the core. When we practice yoga, by default, we are activating and working that core all the time. Well, at least if you're doing it correctly. I'm always giving you verbal cues, navel to spine, activate the core, engage your abdominals. So when I'm speaking about that, I'm speaking about your very deep lying core muscle, your transverse abdominis. As I've explained before, and I'll put a card to that video up here if you haven't seen it, the transverse abdominis runs almost like a corset around the body to the back. It works in conjunction with the multifidus muscle that connects to the spine. It stabilizes the core. It keeps the spine safe. That is a muscle that I'm always speaking about and the one that I want you to activate and work. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that you can do just to strengthen that transverse abdominis, exercises that you can do just to work on that. A couple of ways that we can increase the stability or the strength of this muscle. And again, without getting these flexors involved. And one is the Pallof press. So this looped rubber band, which as I've mentioned, is quite a useful piece of kit, is what you'll need. Alternatively, you can also use a cable machine for this at the gym if you have access to that. Just make sure your cable is about chest height. So you loop your band around a structure that's quite stable. I'm not sure how stable these shelves are, so I'm not going to stretch it too much. And again, make sure it's at chest height, so sort of middle of the sternum. And link your hands together, shoulders down and back, knees slightly bent, engage the glutes. These are stabilizing you, and you're going to be engaging your core to stabilize the entire core. And then step out. So you increase the tension on that band. As I've said, I'm not sure how stable these shells are, so I'm not going to step out too far. So once you've created some tension through the band, your hands are clasped, your shoulders are down and back, and everything is stabilized, you're going to be resisting the pull. That band wants you to rotate and twist back. So you're going to be resisting that rotational force by engaging this entire core and then pressing out away from the body and back in with control, stabilizing with the core all the time. And then when you're finished on that side, quite simply turning around and doing the same. If that's too intense for you, begin this exercise purely by just resisting that force of the band and keeping still. So you're already activating all these muscles here, stabilizing the core and keeping the body facing straight forward. And then as your strength grows, you can step further away, increasing that tension on the band and increasing that force that wants to pull you back. Or if you're using a cable machine, just increase your weight stack. And then once you're comfortable with that, then you can actually begin the press itself. So that's very good for that. Another really good way of activating your core, making sure that it works without too much involvement of your hip flexors, is by doing a plank, which I'm sure we all know and love, regular planks and side planks. A really effective way of also increasing that stability and that strength in the core and calling on to your obliques is by doing a suitcase carry. Now, this is most effectively done with a really heavy kettlebell or a dumbbell. I don't have any of those to hand, but essentially holding this heavy weight in one hand, and ideally you would have a mirror in front of you to make sure that your shoulders remain level. So you're not leaning down to the side of the weight, or you're not overcompensating by leaning to the other side. So keeping that stability through the torso, through the trunk, engaging that core, and then walking, carrying that weight. You can see why it's called a suitcase carry. Quite a nice way of doing this exercise in your daily life is by carrying your shopping in one hand. So park slightly further away than you would normally, and then carrying all your shopping in one hand, and then halfway to the car, swapping to the other hand, so that you work both sides of the body equally. And then we have to look at the other abdominal muscles of the body. So we have that deep lying transverse abdominis, and then we have the obliques. So we have our inner obliques and our outer obliques, and they're responsible for that twisting motion and lateral. Then the fourth muscle is the rectus abdominis. Now the rectus abdominis runs basically from the sternum to the pubic bone. And it's this muscle lies close to the surface of the skin, depending on how much body fat you have. And it's this muscle in very lean people that is visible and that is responsible for that six-pack. This muscle's function is actually very small. All it does is when it contracts, it moves the sternum closer to the pelvis. So it's literally that. Most of us, when we want to work our abs, will do crunches or sit-ups or something along that variety of exercise. The problem is that a lot of times when we are performing these exercises is that instead of this rectus abdominis taking on the work, it gets taken over by the hip flexors, because in most of us, our hip flexors are quite strong, they're quite short, they're quite contracted, and we tend to have stronger hip flexors than we do rectus abdominis. So how do we counteract that? We counteract that by employing a principle called reciprocal inhibition, which sounds fancy, but it's a very simple principle. Basically states that if one muscle is contracting, the muscle that is opposite to that will have no choice but to extend or relax. For example, when your bicep contracts and raises the forearm up towards the shoulder, the tricep, which is the reciprocal muscle, is inhibited. It has no choice but to extend. So it cannot contract. It's the principle behind active stretching, and it's a principle which is behind my verbal cues to you when we are doing our yoga classes. For example, if we're coming into a forward fold, whether that's seated or standing up, and I will say engage the quadriceps before we extend that hamstring. So we get a better extension through the hamstring. It has no choice but to relax and extend because of the principle of reciprocal inhibition. So anatomically, if you think about that flexor running down the front, its agonist muscle will be the glute. So for us to switch off the hip flexors so that we can isolate and work those abdominal muscles, we need to switch on the glutes. And I'll show you a couple of ways that you can achieve that. One of the ways that you can tell that you are using your hip flexors more than using your abdominal muscles to do your crunches is that you'll start getting tired at the tops of your legs, so actually in your hip flexors. And the other one is this sort of pain or tiredness in the lower back. Remember I explained to you that psoas muscle runs from the femur through the pelvis and attaches in the lower back. It would make sense then if you're using that hip flexor to do the work, that's where it's pulling on, that's where that pain comes from. So it's not necessarily that you're doing the exercise incorrectly, it's that you are not switching on the right muscles to do that exercise. The body is compensating. As I've said before, the body is extremely good at compensating. So I'm going to be a little bit squee whiff in this one. So you take your band and just loop it around the bottom of something heavy and quite stable. So I'm just going to come off the mat a little bit here. And now pull those feet towards you. So you are really resisting that bend by activating all these muscles. Engage those glutes. Feel all of that working. And then crunching up, bringing your shoulder blades up off the ground, all the while keeping those hamstrings active and engaged. If you don't have a resistance band, you can perform this by using a bench. I'm just going to use this box of blankets to demo on. Again, a little bit skew. So with your legs bent and your backs of your heels pressing down onto a bench or a chair, whichever's easier. As you press down, you're going to feel this entire posterior chain activating. Then engage your glutes, squeeze them, and really pull them up. So you're beginning to tilt your pelvis very, very slightly. Now that everything is active, you can, again, same thing, perform some crunches. It's not a very big movement, it's that slight movement bringing the shoulder blades just off the mat or off the ground. All the while pressing down with those heels and keeping this activation through the back.